Morning, everybody. Let me just start sharing this. There we go. Everybody can see that fine, hopefully. Brilliant. Yeah, good morning. And I'm based here in the very north of Scotland in the UK, so it's 9 o'clock for me. Yeah, and as was said earlier, I would be really keen to have a bit of a Q&A or discuss some of the themes that we'll bring up today at the end of this session. So if you think that there's something that kind of is really interesting or chimes with your own way of thinking as we're going through, please make a note of it or make a note of your questions, or just if anything's yeah, interesting, put it into the chat box, because it'd be really good to get a little bit of discussion going at the end. Today we are going to discuss the peatlands here in the north of Scotland, which is why I am a bog enthusiast, or my love affair with these bogs, these peatlands. They're known as the flow country here in the two counties of Caithness and Sutherland. And I thought it would be really useful just to introduce you to these peatlands in this great bog, so you have an understanding of where my appreciation of bogs comes from, as well as some of these social cultural issues I think that have run through the whole of Peat Fest. We're going to look at the social, cultural and the environmental history of the flow country, because like many other bogs in the world, it's been degraded through different land uses. And this has repercussions for the way that we see it and when we use it and want to use it today. I'm then going to get on to kind of the main body of the theme that I would like to discuss today, which is community ownership, community land ownership and community ownership of peatland and bogs, particularly using a Scottish case study here. So if it's a new concept, we can hopefully explain it well through how it's practiced here in Scotland. And then look at how community-owned peatlands can help to deliver a just transition to net zero, as well as solving or helping to solve the biodiversity crisis as well, not just the climate crisis. Look at community wealth building, which is an economic approach here in Scotland as well. And then convivial conservation, which is a new approach to conservation that's been discussed over the last couple of years. So and these things all tie together quite nicely. So yeah, I've also included some artwork here throughout the presentation at times, which would be quite nice to discuss if you want to. So very quickly, just a brief introduction. I'm a research associate with the University of the Highlands and Islands, and I work for the Environmental Research Institute. I'm not an environmental scientist. I'm a social scientist, really looking at trying to understand the interactions, particularly between the environment, the economy and society, but also increasingly have an understanding of the cultural aspects here too. And I think you'll see a lot of that come through in the presentation today. Also, this is me in the flow country, by the way, in one of my absolute favourite places. I'm undertaking what I would consider a kind of generational relearning of peatlands, because my family connection to these peatlands go back thousands of years, generations and generations and generations, and they've changed over that time period for a multitude of reasons, where I, as a member of this family, are probably less engaged with the bog than previous generations. So I'm trying to relearn these peatlands and the generational aspect and pass that on to my daughter through these kind of Gaelic concepts. And Gaelic is one of the indigenous languages of Scotland, and a language that's spoken in this part of the world, through concepts like Duchas, which is the connection of people and land, as well as Buntlanis, which is the connection of people to land through various generations. And these are two concepts which show a deep connection between people and land, and in my interpretation, a very sustainable and a sustainable connection between people and land. So just because I know that there's people connecting from not just the UK, I thought I would use this map to show where I am and where the flow country is in this great expanse of bog. So it's in the very north of Scotland, and the two green dots are where I'm located at the moment, my town of Thurso. And you can see on this map on the right-hand side, these big purple areas are extensive areas of blanket bog. There's various interpretations of what the flow country is, and in reality, it's probably bigger than these big purple areas. And peatland certainly exists a lot further over this area, but this is a boundary that's been used to try and protect these peatlands with World Heritage status, which will probably go to UNESCO later this year or next year. So it's just trying to show the scale of these peatlands, anywhere between 200,000, 400,000 hectares. You may notice big blocks of forestry throughout these purple areas, and these are areas which have been planted largely in the 1980s and have led to significant degradation of the bog. So I'm going to run through some various images here, and I use these images a lot in presentations to try and spark people into having different perceptions of these landscapes. So with these images, we see old wood being washed out of the bog that in this case could be 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years old, showing how climate has changed and how climate has helped to develop and form these bogs. We have these large expanses, these large flat expanses of bog, these amazing water bodies within, and really showing the real kind of beauty of the bog and these large open spaces, and what could be considered kind of wild land, or where people go to get away from it. Throughout the flow country, we also find these kind of these buildings that are kind of not lived in anymore, but you can almost see that they were lived in at some point. If you go and you walk into these different buildings, you find kind of baths and teapots. There's a fire, a stove in one. Sometimes there's still kind of tins of beer sitting, and they have largely kind of been abandoned or left in kind of maybe the 1950s or the 1960s. And we start to get an idea that actually, rather than maybe a kind of wilderness or wild land, these bogs have also been home to people, at least over the last kind of century, and they've been used in a certain way. And then you kind of dig a little bit deeper and you find more ruins throughout the bog, and they're a bit harder to see because they don't have roofs and they're older buildings. But then you start to see that these are on a bigger scale, and quite often under these houses, there's lots of these, or these houses have been built from the stones of these houses. And you start to realize that actually a further period of time ago, these bogs were much more habitated and were home to many more hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people at times. So you start to get this change in perception from a wild land area or a wilderness through to this area that's potentially been used over the last 100 years for agriculture, going back to find this area that's actually been home to many more people. And the way that these houses have been left and the fact that nobody lives there maybe suggests that things are all not great in this landscape. I should also make a notable mention of my dog Lola in the top left corner. She accompanies me throughout these walks, and she is just as big a lover of bogs as I think everybody else here. So the reason that there's these abandoned or the no longer lived in or depeopled houses largely stems from this episode in time in my part of the world called the Highland clearances. And these largely took place around 200 years ago, between 1750 and 1860. And under the guise of agricultural improvement, people were evicted from their homes to make way for sheep. So these older buildings that we saw in the pictures were where the people lived until they were evicted from their own homes and moved to the coast. At times, these evictions were violent. And then it also brought the end to the practice of transhumance, so the movement of people with stock throughout the seasons. So people would go from these homes and townships into the bog, deep into the bog during the summer months when the bog was more productive, and graze their predominantly cattle there. And there's this really interesting symbiotic relationship with people in the bog, where people could benefit from the bog when it came to the cattle, but the cattle were rotated in a really sustainable way and helped with the biodiversity of the bog, but also never damaged the bog because they were only there for certain periods of time. Those, the first lot of houses that we saw with the roof still on, they were homes to the people who came in to look after the sheep. So we saw the replacement of maybe, I don't know, 10 families with only one family. And that relationship with the bog then, with the sheep farmer or the gamekeeper or the stalker, changed the relationship between people and the bog, and it became much more extractive, particularly with the sheep, and led to degradation in the bog. So over 200 years ago, we had many more people living in this landscape, living within the bog, using the bog in a sustainable way. But then there was this very abrupt change to that, where the people were moved out of the bog to make way for sheep, largely for economic profit. This has also led, and is in part been driven by, Scotland's unusually concentrated pattern of land ownership, particularly in an international context. Large concentrations of land ownership lead to land monopoly and abuse of power. So what we mean by concentrated land ownership is very few people own a lot of the land. And you can see the graphic on the left-hand side. That means that very few people have a lot of social and economic control of the land, monopoly ownership, and in some cases, that's not very good for either the land or the people living there. History has led to this unjust land system, and today the land market is largely unregulated. So that means anybody who wants to, if they have enough money, can come in and buy as much land as they want. And because it's held at such levels of scale, people can suddenly, almost overnight, go from owning no land to tens of thousands of hectares or hundreds of thousands of hectares. Because peatlands are in Scotland's rural areas, what this means is that very few people own Scotland's peatlands and have control of Scotland's peatlands. This leads to problems which we're seeing today, particularly in the face of climate change, and particularly in the face of climate change mitigation, and things like rewilding or carbon offsetting or carbon markets. And these are headlines taken from local newspapers, which show over the space of a couple of months, I think in 2021, the challenge of communities here in Scotland having with large landowners coming in to try and undertake much needed environmental restoration, but ignoring social and cultural and community needs as they do. So these are some of the challenges that I'm going to try and address throughout the rest of the presentation. It's also been done on a really big scale. So I know this is themes that have ran through the whole of Peat Fest and are probably held very closely with people on the committee and listening in today, around how we deal with things like capitalism and how we deal with aspects like decolonization, particularly on a global scale. So there's a number of really interesting articles that have been picked up by the press, particularly the North American press, over the last year. And I would really recommend, if any of the themes today are interesting to you, for you to go away and have a read of them. They're very good pieces of journalism put together very well, and include some really nice images of Scotland's bogs. So one from the Atlantic and the other from New York Times. And again, these explore the issues that I'm going to discuss today in a little bit more detail too. So just to summarise that section, the flow country is owned by very few people, and the scale and concentration of land ownership can cause socio-economic challenges. We have large areas which have been degraded through draining or afforestation or other modern human impacts. We have large areas protected and are being restored and will be restored. And this can bring financial benefit to landowners through carbon markets, payments for ecosystem services, and other aspects of natural capital. And communities are at risk of further losing out from the land that surrounds them. And this is a historical injustice that has been going on for hundreds of years. So The first opportunity that I would like to raise today is around community land ownership. Community land ownership is not new to the world. There's many communities across the world in many different nations and countries who own their own land. There's many who should own their own land, but don't for a whole multitude of reasons, including colonialism and empire and increasingly capitalism. So in Scotland, community land ownership is for geographical membership, and membership must be open. So we have geographical membership, which means there's a clear defined geography, and those living within that geography can own the land. It's very democratic in that there's democratic election of directors, and it's run in the democratic way. And that must own land or buildings. And community ownership can scale from increasingly, in fact, communities owning buildings like pubs, all the way through to housing block or a small park in a city, right up to large estates like we've been talking around in the previous section. I think the biggest sits at around 93,000 acres. The real focus here is on revitalising place based on community consultation and business approaches. The roots are really in the northwest of Scotland, so a little to the west of where I'm situated. And in the Western Isles, for example, 3/4 of people live in community-owned land. Community landowners stretch a whole way across Scotland from Shetland to the Mull of Galloway, and include towns and cities. And community ownership is an objective of the Scottish Government and wider Scottish public. The first buyouts were almost 100 years ago, but the community ownership is a much more modern interpretation. Over the last kind of 30 years, we've seen much bigger numbers grow. The first buyouts were often from communities that were suffering from neglect, usually due to absentee landowners. So very much came out of necessity. We need to do something, otherwise we'll no longer have a community to live here. Albeit now things are changing so that people are taking this as an opportunity to just improve what could be an already successful community. Various pieces of land reform legislation have come through the Scottish Parliament over the last the last 20 years or so that have really led to this development. And it was predominantly a rural aspect, but it's increasingly since 2016 been applied to urban communities as well. So we know that community landowners are increasingly presiding and owning large areas of rural land, and we know that there's a lot of peatlands in rural land. So we know that community owners are capturing and storing carbon by managing and restoring peatlands. We know also that community owners tend to be involved in more than one climate action sector, so more than just restoring peatlands, building renewable energy, restoration of native woodland, decreasing emissions from food production through more local supply chains. So they do this in a really holistic way, and peatland restoration is a part of that, but not the whole aspect. Climate action is also not this kind of separate domain, but it's something that's essential and runs through the way that people live, practice, run business. And it runs all the way through governance, operations, and activities. So it's a really holistic and sustainable approach to climate mitigation and adaptation, and maybe not just trying to earn as much money out of it as possible, as we see with some of the big landowners. And it reflects an overriding concern of care for the community and the local environment, because it's looking after the community that you live in for future generations. We know also that community owners leading on climate action deliver on multiple community and public benefits. There's this report that was undertaken by Community Land Scotland, of which I'm a director, which highlight all the ways that community landowners are helping to respond to the climate emergency. When it comes to peatlands specifically, I'll use a case study from the Western Isles rather than here in the Flow country. And communities have built a really strong local network and collaborate on a wide range of issues. There's a really large percentage of community-owned land in the Western Isles, with most people living on it. And since 2018, these communities have been undertaking peatland restoration projects across these different sites, covering a large area, up to 70 hectares. And what came out of this is that the partnership with community owners allows peatland restoration to benefit from these pre-existing relationships, the trust that already exists in communities, that the community landowner has built up over the years. Nobody knows the peatlands better than the communities living there. Nobody can spur action on environmental restoration better than the communities that are living there. And this all leads to an interesting approach to just transition. So a just transition is a transition largely to net zero, but also helping with the biodiversity crisis, which is socially just, where all people are taken along and hopefully helps with the growing inequality that we see in the world. There's various different definitions of just transition, but the definition that I use throughout my whole work comes from the Climate Justice Alliance with these just transition principles. Things like buen vivir, living well, self-determination, regenerative ecological economics, respecting culture and tradition, solidarity, building what we need now, meaningful work. And these are all principles which I think are embedded within community ownership and all aspects, I think, really appropriate for the topic of peatland restoration. There's maybe just one quick question here you can think about and maybe put some answers into the chat box. Are there other aspects of ownership, whether that's private, whether it's environmental NGO, whether it's state ownership of land, that can deliver on all of these principles? In Scotland, the Scottish Government set up a Just Transition Commission, and the second iteration of this respects and realises that these restoration activities undertaken in rural Scotland on peatland restoration and wider natural capital and carbon offsetting needs to ensure that it is beneficial for the communities that live and work here and help to develop that strong cultural connection to the peat, so that we can use it as to better sequester carbon and to store carbon. So not only is this a principle that's understood on a global scale and deconstructing things and combating things like colonialism and empire, it's recognised by the Scottish Government through their policy as well. Another approach which is appropriate for peatland restoration is developing ground here in Scotland, and it's around community wealth building. Community wealth building is making sure that communities, with all of the strengths that they've got, can undertake social and economic and environmental living in a way that helps to build the wealth within those communities and is not extractive, does not extract wealth out of those communities. So there's 5 main principles which are around plural ownership of the economy. That is many people owning different aspects of the economy, not just monopoly ownership, for example. Making financial power work for local places. So that is any financial power found within those local places, making sure it works for the communities that's there. It's not extractive. You're not losing the financial power from those communities because it's, for example, been extracted out to shareholders who live elsewhere. It's all around fair employment and just labour markets, good jobs, well-paid jobs, progressive procurement of goods and services. And this may sound a little out of place, but this is really where community wealth building has come from. For example, if I'm a local authority or a municipality, how can I ensure that all of the services, or as many of the services and goods I'm procuring, are being procured from the local community or from the local area, so that that's building wealth in the community. And it's also around socially productive use of land and property. So, for example, not large tracts of land being put over to, for example, sheep or grouse or deer. It needs to be socially productive. So when it comes to peatland restoration and community ownership, this could look like much more community ownership of peatlands, because we know that community ownership of peatlands delivers a multitude of benefits. Making financial power work could be around carbon finances for the benefit of communities that are non-extractive. So community owning that land or asset, but also owning the financial benefit, the profit that comes from carbon offsetting. Making sure it's not extracted by a business with shareholders elsewhere or is headquartered elsewhere. It means high quality jobs in peatland restoration. By high quality, I mean well paid, trained. This is something we're struggling with in Scotland at the moment. The Scottish government's putting millions and millions of pounds into peatland restoration, but there's not the people skilled or trained to be able to deliver the peatland restoration. It also means local companies and supply chains for peatland restoration. That is local companies, local people doing the work, not being flowing in and then flowing out and residing elsewhere. It means that wealth is being kept within the community, as well as this socially productive use of land and property, which is inherent from peatland restoration, obviously through carbon and biodiversity gains. The final aspect I want to discuss is this new approach to conservation, convivial conservation, and it's really come from, there's various different papers out there, but my thinking on this comes from this book by Boucher and Fletcher, which I would really recommend anybody interested in conservation or new ways of conservation to go out and buy and to read. It really changed my mind on thinking around conservation. And it approaches convivial, literally that means living with conservation, which is an integrated approach to understanding and practicing environmental conservation. It's a whole earth vision, and we'll discuss maybe what that's combating, but it understands that human places and nature can and should be integrated with both rural and urban spaces. Some urban, or probably most urban spaces, need to become a little more wilder, and potentially some wilder spaces could get a little bit more peopled. It's an alternative to half-earth, neo-protectionism, fortress conservation and new conservation. And the book lays out the challenges to all of these approaches to conservation and why convivial conservation may be the answer to some of these. It's been practiced out a little bit more now in terms of practical projects, but I think it would be really interesting as a discussion point to discuss this in an almost theoretical manner and apply it in more local context. When it comes to peatlands here in the north of Scotland, we could be seeing things around more people back in some peatlands. So we know that these peatlands used to be home to many thousands more people. And when people lived in these peatlands, they were generally in a better condition than they are now. So understanding that maybe we can re-people and restore people to these landscapes in a way that not only doesn't degrade them further, but actually can actively restore them. So this could be done in areas where we need people-intensive restoration. That is restoration that relies on people rather than machinery. And thinking in our sense, the spread of non-native conifers. It could be the creation of new peatland crofts, crofting a system of small landholdings unique to the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. Traditional crofts have now been, or new woodland crofts are now being brought or created out of old crofts or new crofts, and that's specific to kind of woodlands, but I think there's an area to be explored with new peatland crofts. And actually the crofting system has presided over large areas and looked after large areas of peatland in the past. Crofters have historically used peat as a fuel source as well. It might mean rewilding degraded peatlands, so that could be marginal areas of land or fields reclaimed from peatlands with poor productivity, let to go back to peatlands to block up those drains and allow nature to take its course. Maybe somewhat more controversially, it may mean the introduction, a reintroduction of keystone species to aid in fully functioning ecosystems. This is maybe more controversial because some of these reintroduced species could negatively impact the existing land uses. It also might mean things around conservation basic income, a play on universal basic income, but delivered for people living close to peatlands. So care rather than competition, meaning that somebody who lives next to peatlands, potentially a carbon crofter or somebody working and having ownership of those peatlands, could just receive a universal basic income to reduce that potential requirement for an economic return from that peatland. And that would be paid out of general taxation. So also an understanding these ecosystem services that peatlands provide for large urban rural communities, it would be a way for them to pay for it as well. So in summary, what I would really like to see in my area, big, great expanse of bog, is a re-people and repeated flow country, the restoration of people and nature back to this area. A larger proportion under community ownership with additional common grazing, and that maybe exploring technical transhumance. That is maybe not people back living in the bog during the summer months, but maybe the grazing of cattle back in the bog during the summer months through things like GPS collars. I want to see the adoption of just transition principles as a framework for net zero in the flow country. And I want to see a community wealth building approach to carbon offsetting in markets. And I want to see a societal and environmental shift to convivial conservation. Why do I want to see that? This is my daughter a couple of weeks ago when we were out walking in the peatlands, and we go out walking in the peatlands a huge amount of time. And my family and her family and her family on her mother's side, previous generations were cleared from the bog during the Highland clearances from all across the flow country, from many different locations as you go back through different branches. So I feel that the re-peopling could have really positive benefits for the generational learning that both myself and my daughter are currently undertaking in the peatlands. We have some time left, luckily. So I was wanting to discuss in the context of RE-PEAT and the conference themes this year, and potentially also building in learning from the previous days speakers and previous days lessons, how can RE-PEAT manifest action on these things: community ownership, just transition, community wealth building, and convivial conservation? I'm going to just stop sharing so we can start to have a discussion between us. And hopefully you enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed putting it together and presenting it.
Thank you so much, Magnus. That was a really, really insightful presentation and really nice pictures too. I think a lot of questions also from all sides. And cool that you kind of, I think with your question at the end, you asked one that's probably on the minds of all people from RE-PEAT here. So I'm excited to discuss how we can do this work from RE-PEAT's side too. Does anyone want to go into that last question that Magnus offered? Beth, maybe?
Well, I don't have any kind of like answer or anything to it. More just kind of a reflection on the maybe complexity of doing it when we're kind of a group who a lot of us feel somehow, I don't know, unmoored or something like this, kind of having spent time in different countries, and that we ourselves are kind of based across the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, the UK. So kind of navigating how it works when we're so international within ourselves, a lot of us, as well as being kind of located in different places. How do we do it then without it being that really close people-land relationship to a certain landscape, for example? So just to kind of add that into it, you know, that it is somehow kind of what is our role to play when we are coming from that more pan-European perspective or something like this.
Yeah, it's a fascinating comment. I'm just going to take one step backwards before I try and give my own thoughts on it, and should say that this, I've approached this from a very people and generational aspect, but that is no indication that it's an exclusive process. This should be hugely inclusive so that anybody who wants to come in and forge this relationship with this landscape should be not only free to do so, but encouraged to do so. so that new people are coming in. We have a serious depopulation issue here. So yeah, we really should be encouraging people in. This should be socially inclusive. And the fact that I'm discussing various aspects of generation shouldn't be considered any kind of exclusivity here. So yeah, and there's huge amounts of people coming into this landscape to make it their home and to maybe be the first of 5, 6, 7 generations of hopefully new people living in these bogs. But not everybody wants to come here and live the rest of their lives here in one little spot in a bog in the north of Scotland, and that's completely fine too. Even if people are coming in for 1 day, 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 years, they have a huge amount that they can add. Organizations like yours, which are maybe more disparate, or people based across a much larger area, still have a huge role to play in a very localized sense by raising awareness, facilitating these kind of discussions. Potentially you have a lot of people with a lot of expertise and a lot of kind of power in many senses as well, because you're able to pull things like this together in a really interesting and spectacular way. So if you can channel that into channel the might of that into local projects or local campaigns. For example, if there's a campaign to restore people in peatlands in an area that needs a little bit of help, you can muster all of this together, an international response to a very local issue. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I would love to hear other people's thoughts on it too.
I think this really relates to something we talked about this morning in just a group check-in that Irene and Beth especially talked about. I think RE-PEAT's been very focused on the international in the last years, I think, also through Corona and these online events. And maybe I wonder if the time that's coming now for the organization is to go back from the global back into the local, and as you said, like support people in organizing locally, so reversing the path from gathering as a community from a more local place, spreading into the global, and also learning from other people in the world, and now maybe zooming back into local communities, because I think Irene said that this morning, that maybe, you know, another thing to do for the coming years would be to really try and focus more on local groups and having PEAT be more locally organized and not so much online and internationally. Anyone else? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. I think you really hit the nail on the head with the question though, Magnus. I think this is almost exactly sort of like the question that, or like not entirely, but it's close to the question that we're asking ourselves as RE-PEAT, like what is actually our role in this whole peatland sphere, where solutions are going to be hyper local and community led. And we've been talking a lot about rights of peatlands, rights of Mother Earth this week, and a few times it came up that perhaps we should instead be talking about peatland justice instead of peatland rights. And of course, community ownership is a form of that sort of justice and self-determination, and giving the peat back to the people who know about it and who have a relationship to it or to them. And I wonder, and I'm a bit afraid, that if you are an international group, or if you're someone who doesn't know the local context so well, but still sort of wants to contribute to it, that it can almost turn more extractive, and it can actually be almost like a bit disrupting to the local community rather than be of any help. So like finding the right way for RE-PEAT to contribute to these struggles and to be part of it and to do more good than bad, in a sense, I think that's yeah, that's definitely a question that is on my mind, at least. I don't know about other people. And perhaps that would be skill sharing, or bringing awareness, or doing a really large media campaign, or bringing experts together with people that are doing this local organizing, or like it can take many different forms. And perhaps we are, as a group, in a very nice spot where we've made a lot of connections over the last years in a very multidisciplinary way. And maybe a local community that wants to do this land ownership, community buyout type of stuff, doesn't know so much about like the global PEAT picture, and this is then like a sort of middle person position that we could take. But yeah, we haven't quite figured it out yet, or I haven't quite figured it out yet. We're really, I think, just starting to have these conversations again. But it's a very interesting question, and I would be curious to hear your thoughts about how an international collective could fit into these local struggles in a constructive way. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
Yeah, no. It's the best part of this is to hear other people. The best part for me is to hear other people's thoughts and interpretations of these, and it's a really good question. And I would look at other similar or other organizations with similar aspirations. And I included one in my presentation there that I think is really interesting, and that's the Climate Justice Alliance. And I took a framework of just transition principles, which they developed as an international organization made up of Indigenous peoples and community landowners, and developed this international set of principles and frameworks, and I applied it in a very local context. And I, or somebody, for example, and yeah, probably I would include myself here, living in this hyper-local aspect, maybe don't have the international knowledge and understanding and experience to be able to develop these frameworks myself. And these frameworks need a collective, it needs to be a collective approach to pull out something that works really well. So could RE-PEAT develop, for example, principles around peatland restoration on an international context around all of these themes, I think, that we know and care about. So yeah, and are there local groups? This is the Flow Countries, the largest blanket bog in Europe. You could have a Flow Country RE-PEAT group working on these kind of local issues that take learning and understanding from RE-PEAT as an international organization, organizing things like learning between different areas, trips, and I'm forgetting the word that I'm needing to use here, exchanges of people and ideas between different areas. Yeah, it's maybe not as sharp an answer as I would like to give, but hopefully somewhat of an answer.
Thank you. I think Svante has another question or comment.
Yeah, I have a question and a comment. I'm a bit unsure. I might start with a comment because it fits a bit to Irene's question before, because I was thinking the same thing, that actually it's locally dependent on what like local groups need, because I talked about this with Frankie. I'm currently in northern Germany, and here is a local community that fights for their peatland because it's going to be degraded. And I feel like the question in Scotland is quite different, as you try to re-people areas again and to bring people in there to restore them. So I guess like the topics can be locally very different to each other. So this idea of creating really like local groups or being somehow a hub that communities can approach and we organize something for them would be very helpful in a way. So that was the comment I wanted to make. And the question I had was that I really like this idea of re-peopling landscapes and maybe even paying them a universal basic income for their work. And I wanted to ask if there are already pilots of that, like if there are already some of these communities. Yeah,
what a fascinating question. So re-peopling at the moment comes almost out of a 100-year-old idea that came from resettlement of these some townships which were cleared of people after World War I. So soldiers in the UK, particularly from the Highlands and Islands, who went off to fight in World War I, were promised land when they came back from the government. And so the government ended up at various times buying land or facilitating the resettlement or the re-people of people there. And that happened 100 years ago. And the idea now is, and it's in part an antidote to top-down rewilding, which misunderstands these landscapes as wilderness areas rather than cleared areas, is this idea of repeopling. And so there are some areas in Scotland where there's early discussions. There's one area in the flow country, in fact, or the flow country landscape, where the idea would be that you would, the community is to purchase some area of forestry off of the state, the government who owns it, and re-people this area through the creation of new woodland crofts. There's private landowners talking around this as well. Hold my hands up and give some private landowners their credit when they're due it. There's private landowners looking at the restoration of people, largely because they see it as a necessity to help to deliver environmental restoration. They need people in these places to be able to undertake the environmental restoration on a scale which is really needed. There are some early examples building off some older examples, but we're quite early on in this development. One final point on that, it's increasingly been recognised by government and various pieces of legislation that we need to repopulate these areas as well, not least in the most recent national planning framework for Scotland, which recognises the repopulation of some areas.
Just one short question between like the first area that you mentioned. Was that a peatland area or was that a forestry area?
Yeah, so it happened over numerous different places. One good example is Galton in the Western Isles, which has a significant area of peatland, which is under the custodianship of that community, under common grazings.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So it might be, I don't know, an idea for RE-PEAT to like reach out to them and have some local activity there. Okay.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to put you in touch with all the right people you need there.
Okay, I might leave Diane for a question.
Hi, Magnus. Just really interesting. Thank you. I'm just thinking that I'm not sure if you could give me some examples. I think you might have just mentioned them of where there's been a private landowner who's beginning to do the right thing and realize that they need to start thinking about, because that's part of the campaign I'm doing at the minute. Sort of, I don't know, you know, Guy Shrubsole's list of all the major peat landowners. We're sending small pieces of artwork, little blankets for them to help them to think about mending their blankets, and it's an interesting one. I don't know if it'll ever make any difference, but I'd be really grateful to know about any landowners. We've had a real struggle trying to find good exemplars, really. So that would be brilliant. Any links?
I hate to give a good exemplar from a private landowner because I spend so much of my time pointing out the challenges that come with private land ownership. But there's people like Jeremy Leggett here in Scotland. He has taken an entrepreneurial approach to rewilding and restoration, and he's got one estate, Bunloit, another estate, Bildorney. So I don't agree with everything that Jeremy's doing, but certainly from a private landowner perspective, he's probably one of the most progressive.
What was his surname, Magnus?
Leggett, Jeremy Leggett. His company, I think, is Highland Rewilding. Some really interesting examples there. Again, I don't agree with it all, but there are some interesting examples. If you want to drop me an email, and my email is really easily found, I think, just on our company website.
Thank you.
Priyanka, would you like to ask your question?
Oh, yeah. So in the beginning of the week, we talked a lot about the notion of rights, the notion of ownership, of property rights, and how this is one of the main things which has given the sense of entitlement of people to hold, have like a higher place over nature and kind of dominate nature. So by the way, I also really enjoyed your talk and everything. Thank you for coming. I was just wondering, maybe to me it felt like community ownership just alone could further this notion of like, again, using the word ownership. So maybe like furthering rights of nature, like a rights of nature clause alongside with community ownership, especially like in Western nations like in Scotland or in the Netherlands, where like we do have this notion of permits and rights of nature, like ownership could be really important and maybe like even needed. So yeah, maybe if you could talk a little bit on that, of like maybe we could supplement community ownership with
absolutely. Even the language ownership is not doesn't sit very comfortably with me, but we use it in a way because it enacts legal protections, really. So if you look at some Indigenous communities elsewhere in the world who don't have ownership of their land, they can run into legal problems where they're not legally recognized. And for example, when big corporations come in to look to exploit that land, because they don't have legal ownership of the land, they can run into challenges. So whilst the language doesn't quite sit comfortably with me, it's useful in different senses. Communities would probably feel that they less have ownership, it's more kind of custodianship of the land. Increasingly big private landowners are actually adopting that language as well, which is, I think, kind of funny in a sense, that they're talking around their custodianship of the land. We have the Scotland's biggest private landowner is an absentee landowner, but he talks around custodianship of his land and a 200-year vision for his lands. So even it's creeping into the private landowner perspective. I don't think that answered your question incredibly well, but hopefully it spurns a little bit more thought.
Yeah, I was also wondering, maybe it's difficult with language, you know, if an idea has been going on for so long, so like the notion of community ownership is like gaining a lot of traction, to like change the word ownership, but maybe something like governance or like I don't know, like autonomy or things like words like this, which have been used a lot in Aotearoa in New Zealand, where it kind of acknowledges the issue word of owning, and has emphasizes the things that you were saying of like responsibility and reciprocity of people and the land.
Yeah, do you know, that's a really interesting idea. I'm going to pose to some colleagues and friends and networks to ask, because I don't think it's a question that we in Scotland have tackled, and we probably should. And that's just challenging our own kind of ingrained ideas too. So I'm going to go back and do some thinking on that and try and have an understanding with a wider network there too. I'm conscious of time, and there was one question which came up in the chat, and it was around some of the artwork, and I just wanted to address that. And I have been using excuse me, I'm loaded with a cold. I've been using an AI engine to imagine what future of peatlands could look like here in the north of Scotland. So these are all AI generated images, whereby the keywords that we use to generate them were exploring issues of restoration and rewilding and repopulating, RE-PEATing. And I thought the one looked really kind of quite beautiful at times, but also to really raise the question, how can we use things like artificial intelligence and AI generation to develop our own thinking or challenge our own thinking but always doing it in a way that hopefully doesn't exploit others, and raising those ethical considerations around using AI too. So just one last thought to kind of finish out with.
Thanks, Magnus. I can imagine you can also capture a lot of people with these attractive images. They really look great. I'm wondering if you quickly wanted to ask your question, because then I think most people that have posted one could ask this, or are you fine?
I don't know if my microphone is good.
Oh, we can't hear you. Okay. Yeah, I mean, shall I ask it for you, or shall we end the session? Okay, quickly, like a quick question, maybe, if it's okay for you. Now I have to find it. I think the question was if the community ownership could include the non-human, but I can't find the question right now. Somewhere in the beginning. Can the community and community ownership also include non-human life?
Yeah, what a fascinating question. And I think, yes, it should. The concept I alluded to in one of the first slides, the Gallic idea of Dukas, or Dukas does and do that. And it's this integration between people and land and the environment and non-living, and that integration between all of them. So my kind of white male UK privileged position maybe doesn't have the language yet to be able to understand and explore those concepts, but I think there is a way to explore those concepts through the things of like the Indigenous language and Indigenous peoples from across the world, where we can learn from in that respect.